different solutions, because I think a lot of the solutions that we're looking at now that we need to implement are incremental. And I don't have any critiques of incremental solutions. But as we think about rulemaking, as we think about what can be, we need to realize that every single thing, right? Like, and obviously I'm a lawyer, and so I'm a little bit imperialistic about my field, but we are the secret behind. We are the ghost in the machine. We are pushing and structuring things behind the scenes. And so when we have economic ideas, we need to go back and look at the system in which they're embedded. The market doesn't exist. We created the market through law. And so every area, you look at housing policy, we only need housing policy because we have a set of property norms that are grounded in economic competition that determine what housing is going to look like, right? And so I think what will be exciting in this room and you going forward is to really look at the areas of your expertise and not look at necessarily just the outcomes, but what is the structure? What is the superstructure? What is the substructure on which a functioning system would exist? And then lawyers come along and help in the process of articulating that as a system, which is why it's so great to have a number of people who come from engineering backgrounds, who come from programming backgrounds, right? Because they are sort of micro engineering systems in the way that lawyers do societally. That's all I have to say. I don't know if that's helpful.
All right. So I think people have a better sense of what's going on now and the reason why we're here, and hopefully feel a bit inspired and energetic despite it's early in the morning. I think, we've been a little bit theoretical so far, so let's start thinking about the law and design, and we'll start that by going in and talking about the job guarantee. So Professor Kroc, if you'd like to talk, and then we'll have Professor Harvey go, and we'll start a discussion. I'll keep an eye on the clock, so we will raise other legal topics besides the job guarantee, but let's start with that.
Well, can I put you in charge of doing that microphone on the other side?
Thanks. So I'll be brief so we can get to discussion, and I'm just making two main points. And I'm happy to go into further detail and much more specifics one-on-one or in discussion and such, but I'm just going to focus on making two key points. The first key point is unemployment isn't just first of all, it's not an economic necessity. That's, we can go into that more. Second, it's not just bad policy. Third, what it actually is in addition to those things, it's a human rights abuse. And there's a legal human right to having work for everyone who wants it. So unemployment is a violation of this human right. So if you start thinking of it that way, I think you can tie into the human rights movement. You can make stronger arguments that this is not just should we debate it this way or that way. People who are unemployed, this is a human rights violation. And I'll go into more detail about there's a host of international treaties on this. Everyone has a right to work. People have a right to fair and just conditions of work. In addition to that, there's also the angle of, in any kinds of policies, you can't have disparate effects on different groups of people. So on people based on different kinds of racial groups, based on gender, children have certain rights. Unemployment doesn't affect people the same ways. It affects certain groups in worse manners, it affects children as well. When you tie all of that into, these are further human rights abuse arguments. So that's the first main point. Unemployment is a human rights violation, and failure to secure some manner of job guarantee or jobs to everybody is a human rights abuse. And you have a legal claim to that. And the second main point is, as we think about how we design and implement a job guarantee, it's really important. It's great to have lawyers in this room and everyone else who has expertise in this, helping design this, but it really needs to be community driven, and we need to make sure that half the people involved are women running this, that affected groups are proportionally represented, or even having greater representation to make it for past abuses. So in the design itself, I would argue for something like a citizens assembly, where you're randomly picking people from a community, and they have oversight and implementation of how this will all operate, what we're going to focus on, what kind of jobs are needed in our community. And even the best leaning and most well-intentioned economists is going to understand that community, is going to understand different perspectives, and they can't really be a top-down driven design. So I think there's been lots of discussion about that already.
Hi, my name is Phil Harvey, for those who came in late. I think that it's important to recognize that MMT is not a normative theory. It doesn't tell us how public funds should be spent. It simply tells us that we have more freedom in spending public funds than we thought we did. The fact that MMT theory has been promoted by progressives doesn't mean that it is necessarily progressive in its implications. It could be used to justify the funding of a tax cut, like the one last fall. It could be used to justify the building of a wall on the Mexican border. Hitler was an instinctive MMT theorist in the way he ran the economics of the Nazi regime. So that MMT advocates need some other source of justification for the policies that they advocate. And I think that that's where the law comes in, and specifically, as Jonathan pointed out, that's where human rights law comes in, because that's the framework that provides the strongest justification for the kinds of policies that MMT advocates, in fact, instinctively support and promote. Human rights law is, in fact, stable. It's, in fact, determinate. It's, in fact, authoritative and potentially very powerful. I think that we would be hard-pressed to think of a major social reform movement in the United States or elsewhere that has not been founded on a rights-based claim to whatever reforms are being sought. It's a more powerful argument, if accepted, than the utilitarian arguments that usually dominate public policy discussions. You should do this because it's in everyone's self-interest. Yeah, more importantly, you should do this because not doing this is violating my right. The civil rights movement could have justified itself on the grounds that it was economically inefficient to discriminate against non-white people seeking employment, housing, etc. But they didn't follow that road because they instinctively knew that the much more powerful argument was that we want our rights because we have those rights. And we don't really care whether it's economically efficient or not. And I think that the same argument needs to animate the concrete reform movements that MMT theorists propose to pursue. And I think that there's another reason why it's important that there be a reference to that background normative theory, because there's always a risk when you have a positive, when you have a very powerful, positive theory of the way things work, to begin to allow that positive theory to shape your normative judgment in ways that may not be wise. And we have been there before. In the 1930s, American progressives developed a strategy for providing a job guarantee. They called it employment assurance. It was fully articulated in the 1935 report of the Committee on Economic Security. We proposed Social Security. We proposed unemployment insurance. We proposed a national health insurance program. We proposed an aid to dependent children program that was designed to, in fact, pay mothers to stay home and take care of their children, as opposed to the ADC program that was actually implemented. But that committee said the first and most important piece of the economic security program we are proposing is that the government should provide employment assurance to American workers, and that should be done by having the government provide jobs to fill whatever gap is left after we've done what we can to encourage the private sector to function properly. But there will be a gap left, and the report was clear about this at the top of the business cycle as well as at the bottom. So it wasn't just a proposal to get through the Depression. Okay? This theory, if implemented fully, and it was implemented partially in the LBPA, and that's when MMT or simple Keynesianism would have been really. Roosevelt had been persuaded of that, and Congress was persuadable of that. The program could have been fully implemented, and if it had, there would have been no recession in 1937. The Depression would have ended in the late 30s rather than during the Second World War, and the world would look different today. And so that was a choice that was available to progressives for re-implementation following World War II, but another theory had come along. Keynes's theory that, well, there's a simpler way of getting there, folks. You don't have to create the jobs. That's administratively difficult. It is politically fraught. You know it's the most controversial thing that FDR did. We've got a simpler way. All you got to do is spend the money. And progressives adopted that strategy. But in adopting that strategy, it actually excluded what I would argue is a more effective strategy. And for several decades, the Keynesian strategy worked reasonably well. And it all came apart in the mid-1970s. And we, instead of going back and saying, gee whiz, okay, that didn't work out, do we have anything else? Yeah, what about, let's take that proposal from the Committee on Economic Security back off the shelf. And in fact, at the time that Keynesianism was collapsing, there was, if not a consensus, at least considerable support for the notion, well, if you want to create jobs without an inflationary effect, the way to do it is actually to create the jobs rather than spend the money. So that there was an opening then in which we could have reclaimed the New Deal solution, but chose not to. So there are consequences to sort of investing yourself in a theory without a backup or a underlying concept of normatively what you're trying to do. And I think there are two examples of where MMT policy advocacy has suffered from this. And the first is in the advocacy of a program that provides a single wage to all participants. And if people want to discuss why I think that's a bad idea, I'll be happy to do so. But what's driven that idea is not a normative judgment about what kind of job guarantee would be best, but rather that's what fits MMT theory. We need a wage anchor and to prevent inflation, and therefore we're going to propose a single wage job guarantee program. Other area where I think it's had unfortunate consequences is the tendency to say, well, we have to pay for a job guarantee based on what we know about MMT theory. We don't want to talk about funding sources. We don't want to talk about funding mechanisms. They don't matter. Whatever the government spends is what it spends. It doesn't matter where it comes from or how it comes there. That's a separate question. Okay? But I think that that's a politically mistaken approach to the funding issue. And to drive that point home, I want to tell you a little story. Some of you, I'm sure, have heard it before. Back in 1941, there was a political science professor from Columbia, former president of the American Political Science Association, American Public Administration Association. He was an expert in public administration. His name was Luther Gulick. He was an ardent Keynesian. In fact, he's principally credited, along with Alvin Hansen, with having popularized Keynes' work in the United States. Gulick was working as an unpaid advisor to the Roosevelt administration, devising a study of federal, state, and local finances and how they interact with one another. And in a meeting, private meeting with Roosevelt, he challenged Roosevelt. He was principally concerned with what happens when an economy goes into a downturn, and how that screws up the public finances of state and local governments, and because they no longer have the revenues they need legally to continue spending. So anyway, he challenged Roosevelt, wasn't it a bad idea to institute payroll taxes at the beginning of 1937 to pay for your Social Security program? And by that time, 1941, economists, at least progressive economists, had realized, yeah, that was a really bad idea in the sense that it withdrew aggregate demand, lowered aggregate demand, and helped precipitate the recession of 1937. Roosevelt's response, and I'm going to conclude with this, is, I guess you're right on the economics. They are politics all the way through. We put those payroll contributions there so as to give the contributors a legal, moral, and political right to collect their pensions and their unemployment benefits. With those taxes in there, no damn politician can ever scrap my Social Security program. Those taxes aren't a matter of economics, they're straight politics. And I think the history of the robustness of Social Security program demonstrates, yeah, Roosevelt may not have been a very good economist, but he was a very astute politician. And one of the takeaways that I have from MMT theory is that we don't need to worry about the economics when we decide what kind of funding arrangements we want to institute to pay for a job guarantee. We can do it on political grounds. What is the way to fund this guarantee so that it is, one, most likely to be accepted politically, and two, most likely to survive for the next 100 years? And that's the way we ought to think about it, and I think that that's the contribution that MMT theory can provide us and to give us the freedom to be political in that decision. But generally, I think that in a way, the law has as much to contribute to MMT theory as MMT theory has to the law, because we can furnish the normative foundation that I think provides guidelines to explain why a single wage program is not a good idea, and also why politically it might be wiser to draft a law that has a funding arrangement that looks in a politically attractive way, especially if we can sneak in the back door, which is what I've been trying to do in working on HR 1000, sneak in the back door a secret provision that takes advantage of the MMT flexibility without calling attention to itself. Okay, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
So we want to open it up now.